Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Thursday, February 13th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. As California gets its first big storm of the season, one thing that's top of mind is how to prevent flooding.
Levees are not a perfect protection from flooding. Having a levee somewhere does not mean it is not going to flood.
In just a few minutes, we'll hear how the state's levees are holding up and whether they're getting enough maintenance. But first, today's headlines. Valley schools continue to struggle to keep kids in classrooms after the COVID-19 pandemic. That's according to a national survey released this week by the Education Recovery Scorecard. That's a nationwide project that tracks learning loss and education recovery from the pandemic. Fresno Unified and the Merced City School District listed more than a quarter of students as chronically absent last year. A student is considered chronically absent when they miss 10% or more of school days. A case involving a Kern County bakery accused of discrimination is continuing. KVPR's Rachel Levees brings us this update on the case, which involves a same-sex couple and a wedding cake.
The Fifth Appellate Court in Fresno this week overturned a Kern County judge's ruling in the case. It involves a bakery called Tastries. That company and its owner were sued by Eileen and Maria Rodriguez Del Rio after the owner refused to bake their wedding cake. The owner, Kathy Miller, claimed the bakery order went against her religious beliefs. A Kern County Superior Court judge had initially ruled Miller did not discriminate, but the appellate court judge says the local judge misconstrued the legal standard for discrimination. The case garnered national attention, and the state's attorney general also weighed in. The case will likely need to be decided by the state's Supreme Court if the bakery owner's attorneys appeal. For KVPR News, I'm Rachel Levees.
Today is the last day of the World Ag Expo in Tulare, and there, as KVPR's Carrie Klein reports, ag tech has been on full display.
Among the convention's 1,200 exhibitors are an adaptive irrigator and a robotic pesticide applicator. And not too far from those is a precision sprayer that's using artificial intelligence. AI helps the tool spray pesticides exactly where they need to go and not on other stuff, like rocks and healthy plants. It's by a company called Eco Robotics. Crop care manager Katarina Lee says it helps growers cut their pesticide use by a lot.
We've seen drift reduction by about 95%. We're seeing material savings in certain cases up to 95% as well.
Lee thinks AI is the future of ag as the labor force dwindles.
There's no other options for growers to go other than using AI and technology.
Her company's sprayer was named one of the Ag Expo's top 10 new products. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
California almond farmers are facing a shortage in pollinator bees this year that may delay the pollination process needed by their crops. The Fresno Bee newspaper reports the shortage of bees is due to bee deaths happening nationwide. This time of year, millions of bees are needed to pollinate the more than 1 million acres of almond crop in the valley. The bee shortage could also produce more beehive thefts.
Join KVPR for an event with NPR senior White House correspondent Tamara Keith, Wednesday, February 26th at Fresno City College. Get an inside perspective on covering the White House for NPR at this in-person event. Tamara Keith grew up in Hanford before going on to cover world events and presidents for audiences nationwide. Seating is limited. RSVP for this free event online at kvpr.org/events.
And now to our main story. Potentially the biggest storm of the season so far is arriving today in California, making our upcoming conversation all the more timely. Today on Central Valley Daily, we are discussing levees. These embankments are all around us, especially in Central California, and they essentially keep rivers from overflowing. Water releases directed by President Trump in recent weeks brought renewed attention to levees. Water managers in the valley feared the sudden torrent of water from the Cahuilla and Tule rivers could endanger communities downstream. But levees are not foolproof, and they need to be maintained. Even extreme weather can threaten them. You might recall the historic rainy season in 2023, which saw the surprising resurgence of Tulare Lake and took farms out of commission. That spring, a flood control district in the nearby community of Corcoran raised a levee by several feet to prevent more widespread flooding in residential areas. We're now joined by Emily Zentner. She's a data journalist with the California Newsroom. That's a network of public radio stations in California, where KVPR is also a member. Emily recently did a report examining who is responsible for the network of levees across California. She also explored whether the state is really prepared for excessive rain or in the event of unexpected water releases. Here she is explaining the type of levees you might typically see.
The most common types of levees that you're going to see out in the wild are like a dirt embankment or maybe a concrete flood wall. And California has a lot of levees. We're talking about thousands of miles of levees in California. And those levees protect more than 5 million people. So when you think about it, there are schools, homes, electrical substations, and just entire communities sitting behind levees. And they also protect more than 700,000 acres of farmland in California.
And so, as you've said, levees play a critical role in helping keep water where it needs to be and not having that water impact communities in other areas. But where do California's levees stand right now? Are they in good enough condition to keep doing their job?
That's a really hard question to answer because a lot of people assume that levees provide a level of protection that experts say just isn't possible. So the people who study levees have told me that it's important to remember that a levee is really just a dirt structure holding back a river, and the nature of that river is to flood. And with that being said, I'm not saying that all levees in California are on the brink of collapse, but it's just important to remember that these are fallible man-made structures. So Ann Willis, who's with the advocacy group American Rivers, says that levees are a cause for increasing concerns. And she says that even though the levees in the Central Valley held up after Trump's water release, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any damage.
When levees don't fail, these high flows just increase the risk that they will, because the pressure of the water itself is providing wear and tear to the levees.
The thing is, no one really knows the condition of California's levees because they're managed by so many different entities. But we do know that they got a D grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers in 2019.
And Emily, that water that you mentioned that was released from the 2 dams in Tulare County earlier this month by order of President Trump, that raised a lot of eyebrows here in the Central Valley and caused concern among many. In your recent report, you talk about how that sudden flow of water could have caused some major damage to levees downstream. What did you hear from experts about that water release?
Experts were just really taken aback and really concerned when they heard about that. I heard a lot about the concern over the lack of notice to water managers and the lack of input from water managers. And I also heard a lot of concern about the fact that this release was not a decision that was called for by the people who are managing that water day in, day out. And kind of a sentiment that if those experts who are, again, in that daily work of managing that water are not saying, okay, we need to make this release from this reservoir, that there's some concern about why are we doing it then? And so just a lot of concern about that lack of notice, that lack of input, and just feeling like this was not a release that was made with good reasonings based in the facts of hydrology.
Do we know what the risk is of a levee breaking? Like, what would it take for a levee to collapse?
That is a question that we can't really answer overall, and that is in part because every levee is different. And so what it is going to take for one levee to break is not going to be what it takes for another levee to break. Levees across California are all in different conditions, in different states of maintenance. There are some levees that are being inspected regularly by government agencies. There are some levees that exist on private lands that we don't really have any information about the condition of them. So the risk or the probability of that happening is really difficult to say because we don't have a lot of good information about that. But again, we do know that more than 5 million Californians live behind levees, and those levees protect about 3,000 critical structures, which are things like schools and fire stations and electrical substations, like we said. So the potential damage to be done by these levees breaking is significant. And we just don't have a great idea of, like you said, what it would take for a levee to break.
And what about for people who live behind these levees? What else would they need to know?
Well, unfortunately, we saw what happens when levees fail in Pajaro in Monterey County in 2023 because a winter storm there breached a levee, and that levee was decades overdue for maintenance, and it ended up flooding a community of a lot of farm workers. And then that same year when we were having those intense winter storms, it was really touch and go with the levee that protects Corcoran in the Central Valley, and that's a city of about 22,000 people. So both Pajaro and Corcoran point to a growing concern in California that the levees just may not be up to handling those intense storms that climate change is already bringing.
Anything else you'd like to add, Emily?
Something that comes up a lot with the experts I talk to is something that I've mentioned earlier, but experts have frequently told me that they think it's really important for people to remember that levees are not a perfect protection from flooding. Having a levee somewhere does not mean it is not going to flood. These are structures that are holding back rivers that are just a wild force of nature. And that basically we shouldn't be letting levees make us feel like there's no risk of somewhere flooding. And that if you are living near a river or a waterway, you are living with a continued what they call residual risk of flooding. And that residual risk is always there. So that levee being there is a level of protection, but it is not a perfect protection. And it is not something that we should really look at and say, okay, there's a levee here, I am 100% protected. Because that's just something that experts have brought up to me over and over again as something that they really wish that the public understood a little bit more and that there was a little bit more education about, that there is always a risk of flooding if you live in a floodplain, whether or not there is a levee.
Emily Zentner, reporter with the California Newsroom. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's today's show. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.